So good morning. The opening panel is going to be setting the broader context for the conference. We're pleased to have three subject matter experts. Alice Hill, who is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council of Foreign Relations here in Washington. Carlos Martin, again, the David M. Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Metro here in Washington, also serves as the Director of the Remodeling Futures Program at Harvard University, and Francis Bouchard, Managing Director for Climate at Marsh McLennan here in Washington, D.C. So the way we're going to structure this panel, first we're going to prompt all three of our panelists to reflect on the broad themes of the conference, that is enhancing equity, that Helen referenced, improving resilience and stabilizing markets, and then we'll drill into some more granular questions, drawing on the subject matter expertise and experience of our three panelists. But just kind of setting the broader context, we've already addressed some of these themes. We talk a lot here at American University about attribution science, that is the growing discipline linking climate change to extreme weather events. We've seen significant advances in attribution methodology. We do not yet have the ability to say that this or that extreme weather event, hurricane, or fire is directly attributable to climate change. But we can say with absolute certainty that climate change is a threat multiplier. Literally pouring fuel on the fire, supercharging storms, and heightening the risk to both property owners and insurance companies. And we have seen the cascade of extreme weather events, flooding now in Libya. Recent reports indicated up to 20,000 people died as a result of the floods. A year ago, you recall, in Pakistan, about a third of that country was covered with floods, displacing on the order of 33 million people. In the state of California, making an abrupt transition from a historic drought to atmospheric rivers and record snowfalls that are now menacing parts of Southern California as well as Central California. Wildfires, the recent tragedy in Maui, also the fires in Greece this past summer, the biggest in EU history. So against this context, we're going to be looking at the impact, the disruptive impact on the insurance industry as well as the reinsurance industry. And already we have seen major insurance companies, Allstate, Farmers Insurance, that are withdrawing from California. We have seen spikes in property insurance premiums that are driving many homeowners out of the market, and so on. So I want to begin just by asking, prompting all three of our panelists, we'll devote about 45 minutes to the panel discussion, and we'll reserve the last 15 minutes for a Q&A. So to begin, tying the panel to the three themes of the conference, I would like the three panelists to reflect on their thoughts on the equity issue. That is, what steps can we take at the public-private NGO levels to address the issue of equity in property insurance? Carlos.
Okay, that's a big question. Let's break out the sectors and what each role is, right? So clearly on the public sector side, we have major challenges with regard to the accessibility and affordability of insurance. So if we're talking specifically about equity, we need to think about ways to make sure that insurance is affordable, right? And that insurance practices are equitably implemented for communities of color and low-income communities in this country. So if we can already dive into policy recommendations, which I would recommend that we start as quickly as possible, we have to start thinking about means-tested insurance policies for NFIP. We need to start thinking about how federally we deal with state insurance commissioners to make sure that state-related, state-provided insurance is also affordable for communities. And we have to think about the investments that the federal government makes into communities and in which communities.
Thank you. Alice?
Sure, thank you so much, David. What a pleasure to be here with all of you. This is a little bit like coming home for me. My husband just stepped down as provost at American University. I happen to be on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund, and I sit on the board of the domestic subsidiaries of Munich Reinsurance here in the United States. So this has been an issue and a place that I have been working in for a number of years. I think Carolyn and Helen have done a fabulous job of summarizing what is at stake here. I just want to step back a little bit with context for you in my answer to this question, David. And I'm really delighted to be with these friends on this panel. So I got involved in this issue back when I was in the government, initially at DHS, writing the first adaptation plan, and then at the White House, heading resilience efforts on the National Security Council. And as we saw the buildup of climate impacts, of course, far less dramatic than they are today, everybody said, well, what about insurance? We should get, the insurers are going to solve this for us. And I can tell you that is a meme I have heard in 100 different rooms. The insurers are going to solve this for us. But we have to remember, this is a for-profit industry, other than we're talking about our government program, the National Flood Insurance Program. So if you're a for-profit industry, your calculations are going to be a little different than they are for a government program. And then we have a tremendous moral hazard here. We have all the building, where we build and how we build decisions are made at the local level. So whether you have a strong building code, it is a decision for the state or local governments. Whether you're going to build in the floodplain or not, or in the wildland-urban interface, or whether you're going to have enough exits for the homes or to get in and out of the fire trucks is a local decision. But everyone assumes, because also we have the federal flood insurance program plus all these disaster programs, that the federal government's going to come to the rescue. Many times it does not, but we also have a climate bailout system. So after Katrina, huge amounts of money into Louisiana. After we have these big events, Congress will say, oh, we got to appropriate a lot of money to help these communities build back, but we don't yet have the systemic requirements that we build back better or safer. So in a for-profit industry, I think it's hard for those, that industry. They can do pilot projects and innovative things, and we have Raghavir Vinakulu from Munich Re here, who's been working very hard on coming up with innovative products for Munich. There are others that work on this. Mike Peterson from the California Department of Insurance, I hope is here. Carolyn and I had a working group for the Department of Insurance looking at great ideas. But it's hard work to find the space that the private sector will be. So then it's really got to be what we're talking about, a federal disaster insurance, or maybe state. But we've got to think about government when we're talking about those that are most likely to be uninsured and that have the least means to pay for insurance. So when we're talking about those, I think we should get busy about talking about what the government can do, because I think that will be the backstop. That's my opinion of looking at this for many years and thinking about what the industry can do. I can't wait to hear what Francis says, because he's been working on the private sector side.
MIT? All right. First of all, so that we can have a little fun here, I want to make it clear that anything I say is me only. I'm not speaking for my employer. They may agree or disagree with what I'm going to say, but I want to make sure I can just kind of lay it out there. And Carolyn asked, let's have a little fun, so let's do that. I agree with everything that's been said so far, but the theme you'll hear from me multiple times in this panel is we are, even from these comments, you can see that we are self-limiting the role of the insurance sector to risk transfer. We're already defining ourselves that the only place we have an impact is when we can price a risk and transfer that risk. And I think that is underselling the role that the insurance sector can play here. You know, many of you have probably had the same experience in terms of going into a catastrophe zone after the event happened. cars are going out, out, out. It's traffic, traffic, traffic. Cars are coming in at 80, 90, 100 miles an hour, and guess who's in those cars? Us. The insurance sector is in those cars. We're going to the risk. For the last 10 years, I've been deeply involved in SBP and their transformation and the impact they're having, and it's really opened my eyes to the fact that when that caravan of insurance claims adjusters are coming into a community, they're only going to part of that community. And there's an entire part of that community that's never met a claims adjuster, that probably, as we've heard, doesn't buy insurance. Perfecting our ability to price risk is not going to solve the issue for people who aren't buying insurance. So my suggestion, and I agree with everything that's been said here, is that the insurance sector needs to open its aperture and recognize that it is a key component in a broader ecosystem of disaster preparedness, resilience, and recovery, and start to play in other parts. And I don't mean give insurance away. I worked for insurance companies for 30 years. I know how we make a profit. I know how we have a loss. And I'm not suggesting that the insurance sector become a subsidy for non-profitable business. That's not at all what I'm saying. But we have capabilities that can be used by other players here that we are not sharing. We have expertise, we have passion among our employees, and we also have the ability to partner. And I'd say, one area that has candidly disappointed me is in the federal context. The insurance industry tends to only get involved in those parochial issues that affect them very, very discreetly. Whereas, like I said, disaster is this broad ecosystem, and there are other pieces of legislation and concepts moving around that the insurance sector just cedes, to others. So opening our aperture and recognizing that there is dramatically more we could be doing on the legislative front, I'd cite, and maybe it's going to get referenced here at some point today, and Anya, keep me honest, the Disaster Simplification Act, where we have a one app. Right now, if you have to go through, and hopefully no one in this room will ever have to go through this, if you have to go through the labyrinth of federal agencies after a disaster, you think FEMA is one. No, then you got to go to SBA. Wait, I'm not a small business. No, go to SBA. Make sure you get rejected from SBA. That's the best thing. I mean, it's crazy, right? And they all have different requests. There's a piece of legislation that SBP has been promoting that would say you have one application for all three agencies. Imagine you're in that situation, 10 days after disaster, and you've lost everything, and you have no money and nobody to help you, and you've got to go through three crazy processes. Now it's one. I mean, simplifying people's lives after a disaster is something the insurance sector knows a lot about. We've been doing it for many, many years. And getting involved in helping others do the same thing is something I think we can and should be doing. The last point I'll make, David, is I think that Zach will be talking about the Recovery Acceleration Fund later today or tomorrow as well. That's another idea that could literally transform people's lives. People who rely on HUD funding that comes 2-3 years later after a disaster, those communities have already dispersed. The insurance sector, again, without jeopardizing its for-profit status and its quarterly, I probably wrote 30, 40 quarterly results announcements. I know what goes into those. Without jeopardizing that, we could have a major impact in helping millions and millions of people and thousands or hundreds of communities remain intact after disasters. But we got to use peripheral vision. It's not only the risk transfer mechanism that we have at our disposal.
Thank you. So let's pivot to the second theme of the conference, that is resilience. The extreme weather events we've referenced, the torrential rains, overwhelming infrastructure, storm management systems. So the question here is what can be done, and these effects having a disproportionate impact on low-income communities, and a single weather event can set back a community for years or even decades. So the question, what can be done at the federal, state, local level, as well as the private sector with respect to bolstering our ability to withstand weather events and bounce back resilience? Carlos?
I feel like Carolyn and Helen set the stage here, right? I mean, clearly there's a connection between mitigation opportunities. So I think what we don't really fully understand is the scale of and the aggregate effect of regional infrastructure, community level infrastructure, and property level infrastructure. I think that's something that we still need to understand at a place-based level of analysis. But I think, so number one, mitigation. We can do things to make sure that new development and existing development, I always remind my colleagues, 99.8% of homes in this country already exist. So building codes aren't going to necessarily change the vulnerability, the exposure of those properties. So it's important to account for retrofits, et cetera, as being part of our mitigation strategy. Second, I think we often rely on physical strategies where there are a lot of very fascinating social programming opportunities, buddy programs, senior check-ins in your neighborhoods, like neighborhood level cohesion programming that I think could also be particularly helpful in building resilience in communities. Unfortunately, that are less quantifiable in terms of their outcome. And certainly, even though we've all read Eric Kleinenberg's work, we all know that these things have an effect on health and financial outcomes. I'd say I would agree about consumer awareness about their risks, because when you're more aware of your risk, you're more likely to act on them. I think the challenge is that we need to look at the enforcers, the institutions of that information, and not just look at the consumer as sort of being the end recipient. So things like, I know there are colleagues in the room who are big proponents of property disclosures during exchanges or home purchases and that sort of thing. The verdict is still out whether property disclosures make a difference, because the reality is some people just don't have choices when they're making their housing decisions. They can only afford certain kinds of properties. So even knowing their risk, they may still have to take those things. But all those three strategies, I think, are absolutely critical.
Good, thank you. Alice, your thoughts on the resilience problem?
Sure. Well, look, we have a tsunami that's already beginning to unfold across the globe of these catastrophic events. And what we have to understand is that virtually all of our infrastructure was built to the climate of the past. So do not be surprised that the wastewater treatment plant floods, and by the way, spreads bacteria everywhere, or that a hospital generator gets flooded out, or that people can't get medical care, or that nobody can get to school because sunny day flooding, or whatever you want to talk about, because we have an environment built for the past. And here's, I think, where we need to get real. We're still building for the environment of the past. We have just poured a huge amount of money through the Infrastructure Act to building infrastructure. I think we will discover that a lot of that was not built to a resilient future. And why is that? Because we don't have building codes and standards that look to the future yet. All of our building codes and standards are based on historical data. And in some instances, data that's 60 years old. So they're looking at rainfall patterns from 60 years ago to determine what we should build today. So we have a lot of built stuff and new stuff that's going up that is not resilient and will fail. And so as an insurer looks at this, and I think Francis is right, they have some pretty fantastic tools to understand what's going on. Some investors could know more about how your house is built than you do. And if you're in a community like San Antonio, building codes, it's patchwork across the United States. 65% of counties do not use the most recent code that comes out every 3 years. A lot of them don't have strong enforcement. And 1/3 of counties have no code whatsoever. So if you're in San Antonio, the city of San Antonio, you might have a pretty good code. Remember, it's only for the past, but that would be better protection than no code. If you're the adjoining county, you buy a house, there's no code. Do you know that as a buyer? No, you're thinking about what do the counters look in my kitchen? How close is the school? What's the parking like? You're not thinking about that, and there's no disclosure on it. So we have this built environment that is going to crumble. And how are we going to make sure that it remains insured? That's a very tough question. Federal government, I think, has enormous power to change this paradigm. We did it with the Coastal Barriers Resource Act in the 1960s. Congress said, you know what? This risk in our barrier islands, the sands are changing, too many storms, a lot of flooding, too risky for us to be investing anymore in there. So people, if you want to live on those barrier islands, you're not going to get federal money to help you to do that. Seems like a really pretty reasonable bargain. There are equity issues with that. There's some studies that show that meant only rich people would stay there because they couldn't get help. But the federal government said this risk is too big for us. But we don't do that right now. And in fact, FEMA is having a difficult time enforcing a requirement that those who build back even build back to the latest building codes. Lots of pushback on that because the developers will say, well, that undercuts affordable housing. And they'll say privately, if it costs $1 more, we don't want to do it. I think Craig Fugate had the best response of that. An affordable house that burns or floods is not affordable. And this is just a matter of, it's like a hot potato. Who's owning the house at the time it does get damaged? So the federal government could move in and do something, some really bold things. Say, you want federal money? You don't get it unless you do, in fact, have good land use policies, meaning you're looking at no more building in the floodplain. I think there was a recent study that federal government gave a lot of money to states to move out of the floodplain, have houses in North Carolina, but for every house that was moved out, 10 were put in the floodplain. So we need to have a little bit more control about what happens if federal money is involved. This is a state and local issue. It's constitutionally a state and local issue, but if federal dollars are used, I think there's a lever there. I will just issue a word of caution. This is tough business. It's highly politicized, and ultimately, it's going to be about building the political will. It's about each of us insisting for our elected officials that we do a better job. And here's my story. So after Sandy, there was a rebuilding task force, and the task force came up with a lot of recommendations of how can we not have this happen again. And the reason why Sandy, it flooded so much in the tip of Manhattan is because they had built their flood barriers at 12 feet. No one imagined that you could have a storm surge during high tide and that there had been a foot of sea level rise since the turn of the century. So the storm surge came in at 13 feet, overtopped everything, massive flooding. So, of course, everybody said, we can't have that happen again. They had the Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. One of the outcomes of that was we need a federal flood risk standard, and they imposed that immediately after Sandy for many of the areas that we rebuilt. So that was my very first task when I arrived at the White House. I didn't even know what a building standard was there, I'm embarrassed to say at this point, but I didn't. And a wonderful engineer lawyer, Eric Lutfin, walked into my office and said, do you need some help with that flood standard? And he walked me through it, and eventually President Obama created what is essentially the first national building code for the United States, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. And we got that in around 2015, I would say. 2014, President Trump pulled that standard 10 days before Harvey flooded. So federal government's not using that anymore. It required building higher, 2 feet higher or 3 feet higher, just so the water can wash through. Really basic. Yesterday, Eric emailed me and said, I have really good news. We've just issued the guidelines for the standard. Now that's fabulous. But we're almost a decade later. How much has been built that isn't flood resilient? So we need to get busy on this, and it's about reducing risk ahead of time to make it more interesting for private insurers to want to insure, and then for those that are, it's going to be too costly, we're going to have the federal government assist.
So Francis, your thoughts on the resilience problem?
They're not too dissimilar, I think, from where Alice was going. I guess fundamentally what I would argue we need to do collectively, so this is not pointing a finger at any particular stakeholder or constituency here, but we need to get on the same page because we are sending incredibly mixed signals out there. And let me give you an example. We talk about, I think, everybody in this room, and if we were to expand this room to everyone in this city who works on these issues, I don't think there'd be any disagreement that insurance of risk is a good thing, that it helps the fundamental client, whoever purchases it, deal with the uncertainty. Yet FEMA has disincentives built into its mechanisms for communities to purchase insurance. We say one thing, we do another thing. So we should have, a fundamental review of not only the federal government programs, the state programs, the private programs, and by the way, everything that's happening in the private market. If you had taken the time to read the TCFD filings of the major insurance companies over the last 3 or 5 years since they've been filing them, they've all predicted this. Every insurance company uses almost the identical language. So this is not new, right? But it's time for us to actually align our respective roles, to bring it together so it's much more like a chain that is solid and is working in the same direction. Because right now you get mixed signals kind of spread around. The building code is an excellent example, Alice. We spend all this federal money to throw it, the helicopters coming down and the governors or the president in their boots, white boots or other boots, getting the pictures and all this stuff. And then we just go ahead and do it all over again, right? I mean, this has to stop. And I think absent some type of call to action, whether it's from you seem very comfortable, Alice, with the federal pushing it. I think the private sector needs to step up and finally play its role. When I say the private sector, I don't just mean the insurance sector either. The mortgage community, the credit agencies out there. I mean, I'll touch on this later, but our temporal frame of reference as an insurance company is 12 months. 12 months. Okay, is the world going to change dramatically in 12 months? No, it's going to change dramatically 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Insurance may not be the best transmission mechanism to send all these risk mitigation incentives that everyone's telling Alice the insurance industry is going to figure this out. That's what they mean, right? That we're going to figure out the risk incentives that will change people's behavior to take the actions that need to be done in climate. Through 12-month policies, we're going to do that. I don't think so. I think we're going to have to be part of an ecosystem that has self-reinforcing common objectives, and I don't think that's the case today, where we all kind of bring our capabilities to the table and say, we're really good at this, you're really good at that. How do we make this work as a system? Because the system is broken, and the system needs to be the approach that we take. So, I think the insurance sector has been phenomenal in its history on the resilience of the individual asset or the individual a building or office or whatnot. I think we've kicked ass in there, and I think we have a lot to be proud of. Where we stop is building codes. We don't go beyond that into the broader dialogue that's happening either at a community, state, or even in the national level about the system in which we're operating. And today I'd argue that I'm not a scientist, so there are probably people in the room who can either document or refute this, but the ability to really withstand climate by focusing on individual home resilience, those days are gone. This is a system-level risk, and it needs a system-level solution, and the insurance industry to date has not engaged, it certainly has not led the dialogue at the system level. And that's what I think has to change.
Thank you. So the third theme is stabilizing insurance markets. Reference the major insurance companies, State Farm, Allstate, ceasing the issuance of new property insurance policies in the state of California, both residential and commercial. The spikes in insurance premiums, not simply the frontline states, California, Texas, Florida, but also New York, Colorado, Louisiana. We're seeing a similar trend. So I think it's no exaggeration to say that the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry are facing a crisis. So the question, Carlos and the other panelists, what steps can be taken immediately with respect to mitigating the crisis in the insurance industry?
That's a question that's above my pay grade. But the issue of stabilization, I mean, number one, I appreciate the comments from my co-panelists, but I don't think we should delude ourselves to think we're all going to get to the same page without some prodding. And that certainly involves regulation at the local level and incentive federal resources in this case, since it's the biggest pot of money that we have in this country. I'm going to go back to developing means-tested insurance assistance for lower-income households as being one way to expand the pool that would help stabilize the broader market. We also have to be a little more aware of the local regulatory landscape in 50 states plus territories in which our insurance industry exists. I just pushing a report out through the Urban Institute on housing resilience. That includes a significant question on insurance. And what we found is that there still are discrepancies by income and by holding for home property values, et cetera, and race in terms of coverage treatment and the broader coverage and pricing policies. So I think there's still a lot more we have to do to understand how the industry works, to be able to create the federal and state government incentives that would stabilize the market.
Thank you. Alice?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. I mean, what we're going to see and what we're seeing is we have an industry that's regulated by the 50 states and 6 territories. They each have their own system. Most of them have some kind of backup government system. For those, this isn't, not all geographic areas are stressed yet. I predict that there'll be continued stress as these different events unfold. No place is going to be safe. But right now, we're seeing in California, the western states with the wildfire, and then the Gulf states and Florida with hurricanes and storms. So, and then we're going to see the eastern seaboard, I think, with some sea level rise and storm surge. So we'll see these FAIR plans. That's typically what they're going to grow. And that's going to put more money back on taxpayers in some systems. They try to tax the insurers. In some systems it may be, and we've seen some states have to borrow money against this, which raises a bigger question that when the credit agencies finally do start downgrading based on climate risk, they're not doing that yet because of the short time frame. That will be also a rude awakening when you have to borrow for these insurers. So we don't have, and then we had this report from the Treasury Department about its discussion, but it doesn't have a huge role in regulating the property and casualty insurance market. Now, of course, this is a huge market for private insurers. I mean, this is the big chunk. And we've got some big states. California, I think, is maybe and Mike will know, the world's 6th largest insurance market, something like that. So that's big if an insurer says, I don't want to do business there anymore because of the risk, or I want to pause. So we are going to see a lot of destabilizing events. And frankly, we don't have a plan. I could not agree more with Francis. It's going to take a systemic change, and it's going to take all partners. But we're going to have to figure out what role there will be for private insurance here. I was the head of AXA in 2015, who said a 3-degree world is uninsurable. Now, right now, under current commitments, we're headed to 2.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times of heating. It turns out that even below 3 degrees, some places may be uninsurable. And I think if we pushed our friends, at least in private conversations I've had with reinsurers, there's plenty of risks to insure. You don't have to insure property. You can insure cyber, you can insure other things. So we have to be thinking, how do we make this attractive for private insurance to remain? And why is it so important that we have private insurance? And I'm not speaking on behalf of Munich, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, because it's very difficult to run a public program without politics interfering. And you can just take a look at the National Flood Insurance Program and have an understanding. They finally tried to get to actuarially sound rates, risk rating 2.0. 11 states are suing them for having actuarially sound rates. You know, I don't know. Okay, nobody wants to pay more. And that's the bottom line here. We have a huge risk and nobody wants to pay more, a lot of damage. So who's going to end up paying?
Francis?
All of us is the answer, right?
Right.
And I mean, I could be flippant and say there's only one answer to your question, and that is reduce the risk. I mean, remember in COVID, in the days when we didn't really know what the hell was going on, and we were all in our houses, and we were refusing to talk to the neighbors and not seeing our families and whatnot. Why'd we do that? We did that because there was a concerted societal effort to reshape the curve, right? The risk curve. What was it, flatten the curve? Or, I mean, we're all rallying around as a society to make sure it didn't go like this, but it went like this, right? We got to do the same thing on climate. I mean, the only real answer is to harden our infrastructure to be long-term looking out, as you've said about the infrastructure bill and whatnot. The only answer to retaining insurable communities is the reduction of risk. Because money is money, and you know, if the risk just goes like this, it doesn't matter whose pocket it comes out of, there's not enough. So that's the fundamental answer, but I'll go on here since I have the microphone. The second one, and it was touched on here, is I think deeper regulatory alignment. You know, I've had some fascinating conversations with regulators or staff of regulators who are, and the question I ask them is, what happens when your accessibility mandate comes in direct conflict with your solvency mandate? Because remember, regulators have a very difficult task of making sure insurance is available and affordable, but at the same time, not being underpriced so those companies go under. I mean, that is a tension, right, that they have to deal with, and it's only going to get exacerbated here. And no one's given me an answer, right? It's kind of like, well, we'll see when it happens. That's not good enough. You know, we need a clear sense of where is the regulatory finger on the scale. Is it going to be on accessibility and affordability, or is it going to be on solvency? And then we can, again, going back to having a system-level approach, then we know where to do our own balancing act, right? We can adjust to that. So, you know, I think a bit more clarity and transparency on regulatory policy is going to be helpful. And then the last bit, and I think Carolyn and Helen have done a wonderful job of this, is we're going to highlight here over the next couple of days a whole bunch of innovative approaches. So I don't believe that government is the only solution here. You're going to hear about embedded microinsurance in this country. Imagine that. I mean, a lot of us have been doing microinsurance for years in other countries. There's some incredible lessons to be learned from being able to sell insurance to African farmers. Trust me, because your administrative costs have to be zero and your distribution has to be seamless. Now, that doesn't exist in this country, right? But bringing microinsurance into play for those markets where it makes sense could be a game changer. So could community-based catastrophe insurance, which we worked, Guy Carpenter worked closely with, I was going to say Wharton, but I don't mean that. I mean Carolyn. We worked closely with Carolyn and Helen when she was working with Carolyn, you know, to pull together a deeply innovative approach, a totally different approach to delivering risk transfer opportunities to communities that never had it before. You know, so you're going to hear over the course of the days the answers here, right? And all of it, again, has to be the answer. So I think, you know, in terms of what do we do with the insurance crisis, first, I don't view it as an insurance crisis. I view it as a risk crisis. And the insurance is simply a reflection of that. But the answer is going to be 101 or 1,001 different things, and part of it's going to be innovation, part of it's going to be, you know, more clarity on regulatory approaches, and then fundamentally it's going to be reduction of the risk.
Good, thank you. And thank you for the provocative and informative responses. So I just have a few questions, and then we'll revert to Q&A. But just this week, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that the current hurricane menacing the Gulf Coast represents the 23rd billion-dollar weather disaster just in 2023, setting a record. The agency also reports the increasing frequency of such events. In the 1980s, billion-dollar weather disasters occurred, according to the agency, every 82 days. Now they're occurring every 18 days. So against this context, Alice recently published a very interesting report with CFR entitled Climate Change in U.S. Property Insurance. We're making reference to the increasing frequency and intensity of these events and the repercussions for the insurance industry. And my question, Alice, we've already referenced nature-based solutions, NBS, and natural infrastructure. What investments do you see as most promising with respect to leveraging our natural infrastructure to mitigate these issues?
Well, we know that natural infrastructure, so think wetlands, mangrove forests, that they can buffer some of these extreme events. They also act in many instances as a carbon sink, so they're a win-win. And what I've seen in my own experience is typically the knee-jerk reaction of everyone is let's build, and I'll reference coastal, let's build a seawall. Let's just build something hard with cement. Now, there's some problems with that because cement is also very highly emitting, and you just don't know what's going to happen when you have the seawall in terms of the ecology of the region. So certainly there has been a movement to push nature-based solutions, trying to conserve more what we have because our ecosystems depend on our nature. This will be a tension you'll watch going forward, that you'll see the Army Corps of Engineers in big cities. There's going to be, we've got the Ike Dike. You're going to see a lot of pressure for hardening. And nature-based solutions, I have been a huge proponent of. I think we need to now add a footnote to nature-based solutions. And this is truly saddening. We are seeing so much change. We're seeing the sea level rise happen so quickly that if we don't invest in these natural infrastructure now, go out and plant, replant the marshlands, replant the mangrove forests, it becomes impossible for things to take root. And we've given up that chance. And that's what the science today is beginning to tell us, that these events are overtaking some of the solutions that we thought were the most promising. Obviously, nature-based solutions are a lot cheaper typically than gray solutions. And in many instances, they can be more aesthetically pleasing for people than having a wall outside what you thought would be your coastal home than this. But just a word of caution, with everything here, we need to act now in order to be able to get the benefits and reduce the risk today. I guess my message is more climate action now on this issue.
Thank you. Next question for Carlos. You and your colleagues at Brookings are examining potential reforms of the federal disaster management system, sort of repairing or improving what you call the labyrinthian federal disaster relief mechanism. And specifically, you recommend the elevation of FEMA that's now embedded in the Department of Homeland Security as a cabinet-level agency. What exactly would that do with respect to addressing some of the problems we are approaching here?
Sure. I'm happy to proudly disclose that as my colleagues, Carolyn, Dr. Guski, and Karina French are involved in that initiative at Brookings. And that specific recommendation is one of 6 posts in a series that we're putting out on this. So just to that one, I mean, it's not that big of a deal. FEMA has been cabinet agency before. What it does is signal to, one, the authority, that closeness to the presidency around that agency. And let's be clear, we're not not holding the FEMA's feet to the fire, right? Where there are also major changes that we request inside of FEMA to make sure that they could be more aggressively equitable, more aggressively considerate of all of the broader investments that they're providing. But the other importance of that signal is that it addresses all of the other cabinet agencies that are investing in these communities that are highly exposed and highly vulnerable, right? And that's, I think, the question that we always forget, is that there are tons of other investments that are non-hazard related, non-infrastructure related, non-mitigation related. Transportation monies, our economic development monies, our social welfare programs that are investing in communities that are highly exposed. And it's that whole of government approach that I think that one of the maybe 80 recommendations that we've had in the whole series highlights.
Thank you. And the final question for Francis, as part of your work, you shared with me this three-pronged model comprising capital, canaries, and catalyst. And I'd like you to share with the audience your thoughts on the canaries, the analogy being insurance pricing as a signaling mechanism to incentivize behavior. Francis?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to my opening remarks, I think, about expanding our understanding of the role we can play in all this, or the role that we do play in all this. So this, and it's not a model, it's a trick, David, right? It's just a mnemonic, the capital, canaries, and catalyst bit. But the capital side, I think we've gotten dragged into one dimension of that issue as a sector, and that is, divesting from particularly carbon-intensive sector industries. Whereas we have more influence in the U.S. municipal bond market as a sector than we do in the global oil and gas sector, and those are the same communities that we want to have implement the type of NBS or responsible risk mitigation that's going to be needed at a community level. So, we're responding to activists when the people that we need to actually make communities insurable are selling municipal bonds. We're not talking to them about the need to kind of make sure that what they're building is future-proof, right? So we're missing that level of influence we could be using with the capital investments that we make anyway. So I think on the capital side, we should really think through, where we actually have influence and where we could actually change and move markets, particularly in the direction that we all agree need to go, and that is in much more resilient infrastructure. On the canary side, I've kind of touched on it. I mean, I think we're, as an industry, fixated on this one, meaning the risk signaling. But as I think I've said earlier, the 12-month temporal mismatch between the risk and the transmission mechanism makes it difficult. The fact that more and more of the risk is at a community, your environment level, as opposed to your ability to mitigate at an individual home, is reducing that individual nature of the insurance policy. So our ability to send that signal is really getting challenging. And not to be too graphic here, but I do have a lovely picture in my presentation if you ever want to see it. What happens with that canary when they do their jobs, right? Do you remember? I mean, they die, right? And I'm not saying the insurance industry is dying, but when we withdraw from a market, guess what? We're no longer relevant in that market. We are dead as it relates to risk management and risk transfer in that market. So the canary bit, I think, is what we have traditionally done, and that's not effective enough anymore under climate. So the catalyst side is where I ultimately think the insurance industry, if and when it wants to stand up and provide some leadership on this topic, it will be as a catalyst. And let me give you one example of when we've done this before, and this was when electricity was rolled out in 1892 at the World's Fair in Chicago. And not surprisingly, a few insurance companies thought, oh, what's this thing that's going to be rolled out at the World's Fair? And we asked an MIT engineer to go out there and take a look at this thing. And you can imagine what he saw. He saw sparks and this and that, and probably just wires everywhere, and oh my God. And he runs back, probably trains back to Boston. And what does he do? Well, what would he do today? Let's start with there. Today, I think he'd run back to Boston and he'd say, holy shit, we need a new underwriting factor. meaning anybody who's using electricity in their home, we need to raise their prices a lot because they are under severe risk of burning their house down and burning their neighbor's house down and burning the neighborhood down. So let's charge the hell out of these people because that risk is very high. But that's not what they did in 1892. In 1892, they looked at it and said, well, this is a public safety issue. This is not an underwriting factor. This is a public safety issue. So they took the collective expertise of the insurance sector and didn't focus it on pricing. They focused it on safety. And they created something called Underwriters Laboratory. And today, you can look at any damn electrical device, and it wouldn't be used in the public if the insurance industry hadn't set up Underwriters Laboratory to review that and make sure it was safe for the world to use. So the insurance industry literally made the world safe for electricity. That's pretty cool, right? That's pretty profound. Now, is our time to do it again on climate, to catalyze the type of dialogue we've been saying that we need to have here, because there is no other private sector entity with a greater stake in this issue than the insurance industry. And we can either be passive, which we're being today, and let this thing happen to us and around us, or we can say, you know what? This is our responsibility. It is our role in society to step up. I'm not saying it's our role to take all the risk. That's not the issue. But to lead a dialogue that hasn't happened yet on climate from a pure risk perspective. So that's what I try to get across with this capital. We've got a role in capital, but we're being dragged by activists into a different side of where we could have an impact. The canary role, which we're all proud of, which is how we make money. Trust me, I understand how this industry makes money. It's being a canary. But that's not working on climate. So that catalyst role is where we really need to step up and make a difference.
Great discussion, thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions. Please state your name and institutional affiliation and keep your questions brief.
Raghavir can't ask a question, can he? I won't be able to answer that one. Go ahead, sorry.
Yes.
Welcome, Madam Mayor. Well, first of all, for those of you who don't know Janelle, I mean, we all need to take Janelle as a model. So here's a mayor who, Sausalito, California, if you haven't been there, is a wee bit of paradise, right? So she's responsible for beautiful city on the hill or suburb on the hill, and recognizes that climate change is a fundamental, almost existential threat to not just Sausalito's existence, but even the fact that we all want to be in Sausalito. I mean, there's a connection with the natural environment, and she has. I know this because it's one of these people when you talk to her and you have a great conversation, and then you hang up the phone and you reach out or send an email to a colleague, and they're like, "Yeah, I talked to her yesterday as well," and then another colleague, "Oh, I talked to her too," and then you realize that here's a mayor that is not just recognizing an issue, but is actually trying to put in place solutions. So, you know, it's a great example, I think, of the proactivity that's required to go out and actually engage communities that you typically haven't. And I would say I've been in the insurance advocacy space since 1988, literally. I would say that we are really, really bad at reaching out and engaging non-traditional stakeholders. We're afraid of them because so often that dialogue ends up in a rating dispute or a redlining dispute. That has scared us as an industry over the last decade or two or three or four. We need to re-engage in the way that Janelle is doing it as a mayor in terms of finding new partnerships and finding new ways to adjust perhaps, you know, the architecture of the risk so that it can be bared either by government or by the private sector. So it's innovative thinking, it's sweat equity, it's doing all the things you're doing, and we all need to do that as well.
Alice, you have deep California connections. Any reflections on this question?
No, I think Francis answered it well. It's a challenge everywhere. If I were you, Mayor, I would start thinking about if you can tap into some pilot programs, because I think that's where we're going to start seeing, okay, you're already doing it. I heard, so you're ahead of me. Okay,
She's ahead of all of us, Alice.
okay, I got it.
So, hello, Mayor. I was born in Richmond, California, which is across the bay, in a very different demographic than your community. So I would say that the state has already had this conversation, was it 50 years ago, when it created the California Earthquake Authority and the state-run insurance program. I'm not saying that state-run insurance programs are the ideal for every condition, but it's certainly something that the Commissioner Lada is considering.
Yes, ma'am.
Question for Alice, picking up on question from Underwriters Laboratory. The only reason states led the world in internet access to funding facility was conditioned on federal standards. So, institutional promise of marrying the idea of an underwriter's laboratory and assume a compliant.
Well, yes, okay. I mean, I think the solutions are at hand. As I said, I think it's political will. And it's, even the fiscal conservatives will, they'll say, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, we shouldn't be doing this, which we shouldn't be subsidizing mortgages and building in places we know are going to flood. That just is not a wise idea for federal taxpayers from other areas to pay for that. But once those areas flood or something burns or you have some other crisis, the fiscal conservatism goes out the door. So it's all about risk reduction in advance, which requires political will, which gets to something we haven't mentioned here yet, which is our cognitive biases. And after being in this space for a for 15 years, I think our cognitive biases are a large part of the problem. And one of the easiest examples is our availability bias. So we tend, as humans, to judge risk, and this is Nobel Award-winning work by Daniel Kahneman and others, tend to judge risk by whether our friends or families or someone close to us has experienced it. Well, that is a poor measure when you're talking about climate change. By definition, the events are getting bigger and bigger. So I don't know how many times I've read in paper, oh, I've never seen this. I've lived here for 50 years. Well, that's not so surprising. It's fueled by climate change. And then the underlying assumption when we finish the cleanup is it won't get worse. It's just very hard for the human brain to deal with this risk, and I think that's greatly slowed us. So to your question about what we could do, if we had the world at hand, I would start sending a lot more money to adaptation, mitigation. Carolyn is absolutely right. Reduction of our mitigation is so confusing, this vocabulary. You've got mitigation of risk, which is building codes, land use, but you also have mitigation of the harmful pollution that's forming this big blanket around our globe that's heating us up just like your own blanket does when you go to bed at night and you get a little warm underneath it. That's the same thing that's happening, and we need to cut that. And that would reduce the heating, which would reduce these extreme impacts like flooding, wildfire, drought, you name it. So we need to do that, but we aren't paying much attention to adaptation. Adaptation is which is the preparing for the impact side of climate change. The disasters that we've seen, NOAA, we're already up to 23 events, and we're in September, not through hurricane season, not through wildfire season. We need to spend a lot more money on reducing the risk that these events bring. We don't see that yet, in my opinion, from the Biden administration. We do not have a national adaptation plan, so we ask, what should the insurance industry do? The insurance industry is one player in a whole series of players. We have the builders, we have the cities, we have corporations that need access to water, we have the utilities, we have the electric companies. All of these are part of the solution, but we don't have a national adaptation plan that helps us define what role everyone's going to play and how the private sector will help assist communities get ready. So we are way, way behind, in my opinion, on building for what we know is already here, and much less what's coming. And part of that, I think, can be traced to our cognitive biases.
David, I know we're already late, but a minute to add to the answer. The beginnings of that is being put in place, what, last week or the week before with the CDERS designation, Community Disaster Resilience Zones, right? That's the first time we've kind of had a common set of prioritization, based on social equity or, socioeconomic issues as well as peril based exposure. So, and who pushed that? I mean, I don't know if I don't see anyone from the Reinsurance Association. There's Nicole hiding in the back. I mean, that was the reinsurance markets saying we need some prioritization about the risk here. So pieces are being put in place. Now, if Nicole can follow this up with a magical tax incentive bill, which she promises me she's going to do quite quickly. Right, Nicole? I heard a yes, and she's nodding, so please, for those of you taking copious notes, that was a commitment on the REA's part. But that will attract private sector capital. So I think the pieces are almost you can almost, it's like starting a puzzle, right? The pieces are out there. Sometimes you get lucky and 4 pieces are together, right? I would say we're kind of seeing a little bit of that with CDERS. There are 4 pieces together. Now it's a 1,000-piece puzzle, so it's not the answer, but we're starting to get there. So I wanted to make sure people recognize, I think, CDERS as a component of that framework that's needed.
So we've exhausted our time. Thank you to Carlos, Alice, and Francis. Great discussion.